Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the Composting Collaborative September webinar. This is Nora Goldstein, editor of BioCycle, one of the founding partners of the Composting Collaborative. We're going to wait just another minute to allow additional participants to join, and we'll get started shortly. We currently have everyone's phone line muted to ensure good sound quality. But throughout the presentations today, please feel free to ask questions anytime via the chat box, and we'll be sure to answer them during the Q&A portion at the end. We'll also be sending out the recording and slide deck from today's webinar after it concludes today. Just like to give you a little background on who the Composting Collaborative is. The Composting Collaborative is an initiative that Green Blue BioCycle and the U.S. Composting Council founded almost 2 years ago. The collaborative unites compost manufacturers, consumer-facing businesses, and policymakers to share best practices and resources, as well as generate innovative solutions to shared challenges. Our monthly webinar series is one way we aim to highlight best practices and case studies. Our mission is to accelerate composting access and infrastructure to improve soil health and divert compostable materials from landfill. Since the collaborative kicked off in November of 2016, we've grown to have 70 members and over 1,700 subscribers. One of our most popular products, if you will, that the Composting Collaborative offers is our monthly webinar series. And today, this month, we're going to be hearing from 3 fantastic speakers who will be discussing compost use in stormwater management and erosion control. This topic has been one that BioCycle has covered for many, many, many years and is one of the slam dunks in the composting industry. Using compost to manage stormwater and control erosion is a proven best management practice in the United States. Departments of Transportation have specifications for compost use, and many regional and local governments have created ordinances and standards that require incorporation of compost to help manage stormwater. Today's webinar, Compost Use for Stormwater Management and Erosion Control, covers the evolution of compost use for stormwater management and erosion control, including development of ordinances and standards and the various applications of compost to manage stormwater and erosion. For example, amending new construction soils with compost, utilizing compost blankets and socks, etc. It also highlights a brand new law in Illinois that requires state agencies to give preference to use of compost in soil-related projects. To close, a compost manufacturer discusses what is needed to supply product for these applications. I'd like to introduce our fantastic webinar presenters this afternoon. The first to go will be David McDonald with Seattle Public Utilities. David McDonald is a biologist and environmental scientist with Seattle Public Utilities, focusing on soil science and environmentally friendly landscape design and development practices. He works with the public and professionals on best practices, and he leads the Washington Organic Recycling Council's Soils for Salmon initiatives, which is transforming development practices around the Northwest. David serves on the Technical Core Committee of the National Sustainable Sites Initiative and Washington's EcoPro Sustainable Landscape Professional Certification Program. Next, we'll hear from Walter Willis, who has been the Executive Director of the Solid Waste Agency of Lake County since 2007 and is responsible for overseeing the agency's solid waste and resource management programs and implementing Lake County Solid Waste Management Plan. Walter is a board member of the Illinois chapter of SWANA, an honorary board member of the Product Stewardship Institute, and was selected as chairman of the Illinois Food Scrap Coalition for 2016 and 2017. Our third speaker is Ed Wansing with the Compost Company, which is located in Ashland City near Nashville, Tennessee. In addition to composting, the Compost Company offers organics collection. Ed holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Kansas State and a Master's in Sustainability from Lipscomb University. He's a licensed architect in the state of Tennessee and a LEED accredited professional, and has been a leader of the green building and sustainability movement in Middle Tennessee for over 15 years. We are all in for a really fabulous set of presentations today. If you've just joined us, a reminder that we are recording today's webinar and will be distributing the recording afterwards. We also have everyone's lines muted, but please do ask David, Walter, and Ed lots of questions through the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner. And with that, David, I will hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Nora. I'm going to talk about our 20 years of experience here in the Pacific Northwest with integrating compost soil amendment and compost erosion control practices into local codes and also national standards. We'll talk about that a little bit. I'm going to move quickly through some of these slides, but as Nora mentioned, you'll have both the recorded webinar and the PDFs of the slide decks. And in my slides, all of the yellow linked resources in my slides are active hyperlinks in the PDF, so you can open the PDF and easily go to those resources. In 1998, 20 years ago last spring, at a conference here in Washington, we learned definitively from the scientists that as we develop our landscapes, develop our watersheds, we lose the ability of our native streams to support native wildlife, including particularly native salmon runs, and essentially there was nothing we could do about it. At lunch during that conference, 5 of us got together and said, but wait, I think we could build differently and change our construction practices so that doesn't have to happen. I'm going to talk about what we've accomplished in the last 20 years. Want to talk first about some of the drivers for us. Of course, stormwater and erosion control, Clean Water Act. As probably most of you know, in many states, the authority to administer Clean Water Act requirements is delegated to state environmental agencies. In Washington, it's our Department of Ecology. They develop a state stormwater manual that local jurisdictions have to follow or have substantially equivalent manuals. So one of the relatively early things we did was start working on a BMP for the state stormwater manual, post-construction soil quality and depth, which got incorporated into our state stormwater manual in 2003 and every version since, and is the law here in Washington. And that's, of course, had a huge effect. Here in Washington, and I think most places in the country, builders above a certain size construction site also have to have erosion control plans, and somebody on the site has to be trained to administer those plans. And so that's a place that I'll talk about more, where we've been able to tap into and spread this word. Another driver for us, and many places in the around the country, Colorado, the drier places particularly, but even here in Washington, water conservation. The yellow is our summer or year-round water use. You can see the big peak in the summer. That's not filling swimming pools. It's landscape irrigation. The black line is precipitation. And, of course, like every place else, we get less rainfall in the summer than the water we use for landscape irrigation. And we know that by amending soils with compost and mulching, we can cut summer landscape irrigation needs in half. Another driver for all of us, and you in the East have been seeing this dramatically recently, is climate change. More energetic storms, more rainfall, longer droughts. You pick it. We're going to have more variability, and it's going to be more energetic and pronounced when it happens. And we know that compost soil amendment can both reduce flooding and runoff and also increase soil moisture storage so that we can get through our drier summers better. And as I mentioned at the beginning, here in the Northwest for us, we had the driver of salmon decline. But I think anywhere you are, I've been talking to folks in Chesapeake, Great Lakes, and elsewhere, we have water quality issues that we can address by improving our land management practices. And a key practice is really the use of compost and organics, both for soil and amendment and as mulch. So this is some information you probably all know if you're here today. These are graphics off our Soils for Salmon website. Feel free to steal them, use them for your own purposes, or adapt them as you needed. But as we develop our landscapes, we lose the ability of the soil to soak up rainfall, and we end up with more flooding and lower summer flows and failing landscapes. The key practice is to preventing those impacts is reducing compaction where possible, and then where soils have been compacted, ripping them or otherwise mechanically decompacting the soils, and incorporating compost to feed soil life and reestablish all those soil functions. Some of those functions that the soil organisms provide in the landscape include all these things listed here. Notably at the bottom, filtering out pollutants and reducing the need for landscape chemicals, which also reduces pollution, because if you don't have to use pesticides, there's less pollution, and it's also healthier for kids and families. Here's the simple English version of the soil BMPs we came up with. So we have both the regulatory language, but we also needed to put it into plain English so that builders and residents and everybody could understand. But basically for new construction, as I mentioned, protecting existing soil and vegetation where possible, and then where soil is disturbed or compacted during construction, mechanically decompacting and incorporating compost. For existing landscapes, using compost when planting, using organic mulches, and avoiding overuse of chemicals. So we starting from 1998, we started meeting with builders, with stormwater policymakers, with anybody we could talk to, and getting industry leaders and policymakers on board, and then identifying, those key people who would help us spread this to their various audience, whether it's civil engineers, stormwater managers, builders, doing the science, getting scientists involved to show that this really worked well, sponsoring a lot of technical seminars, so that this, we really, tried to give this away and have a lot of professionals take this as information that they could run with on their own. Local governments started adopting it, and particularly our State Department of Transportation, proving that it works well, doing some more science, and that it is cost effective. And we have kept doing, up to today, education, probably 30 to 50 builder trainings a year, plus a bunch of other education around our state. Of course, building effective web resources, the ones that I pointed you to and that are on the last slide. Working with our NPDES stormwater regulators to push these low-impact development BMPs, including the soil protection and compost amendment, and doing builder outreach through the erosion control classes that I'll talk just a little bit more about. So here in Washington, we developed these BMPs that are described on the left side of the slide here. And a key part of that was requiring a soil management plan as part of the construction documents that have to be filed before building can begin, that says what they're going to do to either protect existing soil and vegetation, or for areas that are disturbed during construction, what they're going to do to restore it. Again, fairly simple process, but it's required, so that makes folks pay attention. Another thing we started doing, and Nora was part of this, starting in 2006 or so, or maybe before, probably most of you are familiar with the LEED Green Building Standards. As part of that, or connected to that, starting in 2006 or so, we started developing the National Sustainable Site Standards, which are like the LEED standards for buildings, but they are for site and landscape. So they are designed to work together with the LEED standards. They're standalone systems, but they're administered together, and you can choose from or use both the LEED and the Sustainable Sites standards. And we basically incorporated the Washington approach, soil management plan, protect or restores soils during construction, into the Sustainable Site standards, and that requirement has also been incorporated now into the LEED standard, so it exists in both those national certification systems. A lot of other jurisdictions have done somewhat similar things. Chesapeake Bay, obviously, driven by water quality issues, but City of Denver, Fort Collins, Colorado, a number of other Western jurisdictions, California jurisdictions, driven more by water conservation. They're concerned with their long droughts because, of course, soil amendment also improves the ability of the soil to hold moisture and grow plants with less irrigation. Again, in the PDF of these slides, all these are linked, so you can just go to those programs and see them yourself. Here in Washington, we've worked on educating professionals to use these various BMPs together, both the compost amended vegetated areas, so the amended strip on the side of the highway here. This is a Washington DOT slide. The use of the compost blanket for erosion control, or adjacent to sensitive areas, we use compost berms, or more commonly compost socks now instead of silt fences, because they work much better for filtering construction sediments, and you don't have to disturb them and remove them. The berm you just leave in place. The compost sock, you either just slit the plastic sock and remove it, or you use a biodegradable sock that you can leave in place. Our Department of Transportation and others have kept doing the science that proves definitively that these methods work to reduce all of our common pollutants much better, in fact, than some much more expensive technologies. We've had a lot of builders sign on even before the regulations went into place. Here's a very large development where they stockpiled topsoil and then brought it back, amending it with compost after the houses were framed up and the road bases were in place, and it provides both erosion control, and then they're ready. Here's actually right next door to this picture, so right over, let's see, right over here in this slide is this area where they've installed the sod and the bushes, and that is a for sale sign on this house. And I took this picture actually in early January, so it's a high erosion time of year, but because they're getting good erosion control from the compost BMPs, they can keep working all winter. Here's another site where in October you can see the rills forming from the early fall storms here. They spread compost and seed on these slopes. This picture is taken early the next spring. You can see complete erosion control grass coverage, good vegetation, so the erosion's been controlled, and they've got a great looking site that's ready to sell. So I want to talk just briefly about using compost for these various purposes. And the most important thing is to know your market, what matters to your market, because I guarantee that the markets are different. This civil engineer here installing a bioretention cell is much more technically concerned about the compost going into this bioretention mix than this landscaper here, but the landscaper really cares about his compost quality too. He just cares about some different things. And this watershed restoration person cares about different things for the compost used for this streamside restoration. So you need to know who you're selling to in order to produce a product that really meets the requirements of that particular market. For instance, for bioretention mixes, we need a very stable compost. We use high amounts of compost in our bioretention mixes, 1/3 or more mixed with coarse sand, which provides us with dependable infiltration and dependable removal of pollutants. But we need the right sand, and we need the right compost, particularly a compost that has low levels of soluble phosphorus, nitrogen, or any other soluble contaminants that might wash off into our water bodies. For landscape uses, our builders are concerned most about a stable product that's good for plant growth. So again, not too much nutrients for water quality, but they need enough nitrogen and phosphorus to grow the lawns or shrubs or whatever they're planting, particularly a balanced pH and a high cation exchange capacity, which usually comes with most of your compost products. For the compost industry, you also have the opportunity to sell a mulch material, which is a coarser, perhaps woodier product, which can be used for landscape mulching. So that may allow you to use your overs or minimally composted woody materials for landscape mulch material too. For erosion control, again, the market is very particular. For erosion control, we usually use a larger particle size, this kind of coarse compost that filters better, has higher initial permeability, holds together better on steep slopes. We want relatively few fine particles in the compost mix because it tends to plug up our compost socks or berms that we're using, or even compost blankets. Again, just like bioretention soil, we need low soluble phosphorus, nitrogen, and low soluble metals content so that we don't get these contaminants washing off during the first flash storm events. That usually happens just during the first storm events. Afterwards, the compost biology gets going, and those organisms are very good at grabbing onto phosphorus, nitrogen, and metals so that they're not washed off. Again, for erosion control, in our classes, we really point out to builders that they get a 2-for-1 value out of compost because they are both using it for temporary erosion and sediment control, but then at the end of the project, instead of all the expense of removing a silt fence, they either leave a biodegradable compost sock or berm in place, or just slit the plastic compost sock and pull this plastic out of there. Instead of having to remove those miles of silt fence, a couple bags full of sock material, leave the compost in place, and then just till or rip it into the soil or plant through it on steep slopes to meet our post-construction soil quality and depth requirement in our stormwater manual. So they get a 2-for-1 value out of it. Very important to builders in terms of cost effectiveness. So that's what I wanted to say. We have a lot of resources, background science, other materials linked from our 2 main sites, the Soils for Salmon site, which has more of the background science, more of the design information, and the building soil site, which is more sort of just the facts for builders. And again, some more linked from these slides that you'll have the PDF of. With that, I'll hand it off to Walter to talk about what they've been doing there. Whoops, sorry. There you go.
Thanks, David. Good afternoon, everyone, and I appreciate you spending some of your time this afternoon with the other presenters and myself. I want to talk about 2 main things. I do want to talk briefly about the Illinois Food Scrap Coalition, because it is kind of the primary engine, if you will, in Illinois for a lot of the policy change that we're achieving here. And I do also want to talk about, in particular, House Bill 4790, the legislation that we hope will increase markets for compost here in Illinois. This slide shows some of the origins and accomplishments of the Food Scrap Coalition, and I really like David's slide with the Margaret Mead quote, because this formed in 2012 with literally 10 people sitting around the table after we'd held a very successful one-day workshop on food scrap composting. And 6 years later, we've got a standing organization with a board, administrative assistant, and we've accomplished a lot of things. In 2013, one of the first things we started was the We Compost program, and you can see the logo down there that we've created. We've actually trademarked that. Other entities throughout the country liked it and are starting to use it, and we are very free with sharing it. We then in 2014, we got some funding from the state to do a challenges and solutions report and held some forums throughout the state up and down to get some feedback from the various stakeholders to write that report. In 2015, we took some of that information and got fairly active. We completed the report, and you see some various bills that were passed in Illinois that year. Some do with the first one helped us create the drop-offs for food scraps and also single-day collection events. We do a lot of pumpkin collection events now with that legislation. Prior to that, the state was telling us we needed to be treated like a garbage transfer station, which was not really tenable. The other bills did various things as well with the composting issue. And in 2016, we did incorporate ourselves. We have a board of directors now. We have a paid administrative coordinator. We're able to do a lot more work, and we started a strategic planning effort. We also received our fiscal agent, 7 Generations Ahead, a nonprofit organization, did receive a grant from the Chicago Community Trust in 16 and 17, which has really helped with the funding to get a lot of work done for the Food Scrap Coalition. And in 17, we actually did a report. We funded a study from dealing with the economic impact, and some of the main findings from that report were that with a 65% diversion of food scrap from our landfills, we could create over 3,000 jobs and generate over $290 million in economic activity. We've also, in 17, became a organizing committee with U.S. Composting Council. We're one step short of being a formal chapter. And our We Compost program expanded to over 180 entities that are now diverting food scraps. Those reports are very important, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, the impact of the Challenges and Solutions report. Both of them were part of the trust. What the trust wanted with those reports was that we disseminate them to the stakeholders and also to the state elected senators and representatives. And so we got those reports into their hands so that they could better understand this topic. And it kind of laid the groundwork for 4790. That's right, I got to do my own slides here. Okay. 2018, we have a standing market development committee, and we've been working on getting a list, or not a list, but a actual map, a Google's map with all the permitted compost sites in the state, with varying levels of information about the feedstocks they'll accept and the products that they sell. So we're trying to create a database for buyers and sellers of compost. We did another study looking at opportunities to use compost in the ag arena, where we're obviously looking at transportation projects and also the farming community as 2 large potential markets. 4790 was passed, and I'll talk about that. And we did trademark our logo. And we added another level to the We Compost program for people or entities that are doing their composting on site and aren't using a hauler or anybody else, or actually have enough land or the ability to do their composting on site. And so we wanted to recognize those entities as well. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but I will point out that as a board, we found it very useful to develop a strategic plan so that we all kind of knew what our goals were moving forward, and we had some accountability, deadlines, who is responsible. I think it's very important as an organization to have some focus and to have some goals and expectations for the organization to achieve. And so we have 4 main areas that we've developed various programs and accomplishments that we want to achieve. And this slide is just some of our main sustaining partners are shown. Please check us out on our website and follow us. Creating this synergy is very important as we move forward with this issue. Now, before I talk about House Bill 4790, I kind of wanted to give you the lay of the land here in Illinois, what our current infrastructure and programs look like. We've got approximately 45 permitted compost sites, and about 20% of them have done what they need to modify their permits to accept food scraps. We passed a very important piece of legislation about 5 years ago to exempt the compost sites that accept food scraps from our local siting process, which landfills and garbage transfer stations have to go through. It's very costly and a very daunting process. So breaking that away from the siting process was very important and opened the door for our compost sites to take food scraps without having to go through hurdles that they really weren't going to want to take on. So that was important, and we've got about 20% of our sites now that are engaging with food scraps. We are a landfill ban state. We don't allow landscape waste into our landfills. So about 500,000 tons a year are managed by those 45 sites. To put that in perspective, if we were to be successful in diverting food scraps from our landfill, we landfill about 14.1 million tons per year in our state, and 18% of that is food scrap, so that's 2.5 million tons a year of food scraps alone. If we build upon that to look at the paper and the contaminated paper that's also included that could be composted, it gets us to about 30%, and that's about 4.4 million tons a year. So we know that as we move forward and look to divert this material from the landfill, it's 6 or 7 times the volume of what we're doing now. So, and as far as the activity in our state, we do have thousands of households and businesses and institutions, jails, schools, et cetera, that are diverting food scraps. We are, our snowball is growing in size, and per NORA and Biocycle, we now are the fourth in the nation with communities with food scrap programs. We have 24. I think we're actually up to 26 now. So our ability to collect is growing. We have dozens of landscape waste transfer stations. I actually tried to get a list from the Illinois EPA, and we don't even track them separately yet. So that's something we're going to be working on. But as you all know, in the waste industry, so much is tied to logistics as far as cost. And if we can move material around more effectively to compost sites, it will help us compete with our low landfill costs here in Illinois. So right now, most of them, we only have 4 in the state that we passed special legislation for over these last several years. The rest of the landscape waste transfer stations cannot accept food scraps. So that's something that we're looking to work on moving forward. But as the Food Scrap Coalition has grown in size, we have over 120 members now. We have a lot of compost operators involved with us now. It started as non-government organizations and local government, but we expanded obviously into the private sector and the waste industry and the haulers. One of the things we got a message loud and clear was, it's great we've got all these collection programs, but until we get more and stronger markets, you guys can't get too far ahead of the game. So slow down, Walter. Don't get us too much material without worrying about what we're going to do with the end product. So that was a very important message to hear and to recognize the importance of market development, which really led to 4790, which I'll talk about now. It was sponsored by Representative Carol Sente. And my agency is very active in legislation down in Springfield. We have a lobbyist that we employ as well. So we're engaged on these issues on an ongoing basis in Springfield. And in 2017, I was down in Springfield, and I just happened to stop by and saw Representative Sente, and she had the challenges report in front of her. She actually had it on her desk and was looking at it and reading it, and had underlined things in it. And she looked at me, because we've been talking about this issue for a while, about composting and growing it and how we're going to be successful in Illinois. And she just looked at me and she goes, "Well, what do you think I should do? What's one of the main things we should be doing? I'm looking at this report. There's a lot of information here." And I said, "Well, I think we really have to focus on markets, Representative." And so she looked at me and she goes, "All right, well then we need to work with DOT and Capital Development Board, who does the construction projects in our state." And I said, "Yeah, I mean, it'd be great if we could have them do a couple pilot projects. I know that DOT's used it in the past, but not religiously. They kind of got off of it here for a while." And so she hopped on the phone and started calling. And next thing I know, we've got lobbyists in her room, in her office, and we're talking through how we're going to get some projects going with state agencies. We worked with DOT that year. We didn't pass any legislation in 2017. And then 2018 rolled around, and Representative Sente said, "Well, what happened last year?" And I said, "Well, we had some good meetings, but we really didn't move things along that quickly as we'd like to." And she said, "Well, then we need to pass a bill." And I said, "Okay." And so that report and just being there and having those discussions led to House Bill 4790. And it did take quite a bit of work to work through with the Capital Development Board and the Illinois Department of Transportation, and understanding that they have very established procurement processes, and that we were kind of pushing into those and maybe a little too aggressively for their liking. So we had to talk through some issues with them. But ultimately, we did get an agreed upon bill with those state agencies. And the big thing that we got out of that was we will be working with our Department of Transportation to do 2 pilot studies. As David was pointing out, we're not quite as far ahead as Washington. We still have to do some more demonstration and proof that this product works, and then get it into the specs. That's really our big goal with this piece of legislation, is just to make it a routine thing once everybody goes, yes, it works in those applications, and it's actually cost neutral or cheaper than the other alternatives. Why wouldn't we be using compost? So there will be a report that will be required to be written, and the Illinois Food Scrap Coalition has already reached out to Illinois DOT and the Capital Development Board to offer our assistance. And we've, obviously we'll be looking to Washington State and California and Texas, some of these DOTs that have really done excellent work with compost. So we're looking to ingrain that a little better into our Illinois DOT. The other part of the law, besides the 2 pilot studies, any other state agency, and it's mainly Capital Development Board, which does any renovations of existing buildings or any new construction we're doing in Illinois for state agencies. If they have any type of projects that requires any offsite soil, that they must then solicit a bid from a permitted compost site if it's located within 10 miles of that project. Again, that's why our locator map that I talked about earlier is very important, and we were building it with this in mind so that state agencies can go, here's our project. Oh, we can go to the Food Scrap Coalition's map. Yeah, there is a compost site within 10 miles. Boom, let's send them the bid offer so that they can bid on this. And if the quote from the compost site is equal to or less than the competitive offsite soil bid, the state agency must use the compost site. And the other important component, we were very cognizant of the need for using good compost on these projects. We don't want to get a substandard compost product into these projects and then not be able to show the true power of compost. So we did write into the law that it has to meet the Composting Council seal of testing assurance or an equivalent to that. So looking forward to 2019, we do need to look at expanding the exemption for our landscape waste transfer stations so that we can move this material around more effectively. We also need to re-engage with funding. We did have a state agency that used to give grant funds out for food scrap projects. That agency is kind of, it's diminished in its stature now, and we're looking to move that program over to IEPA and hopefully get $1 to $1.5 million a year invested into our composting programs. We also have expanded as the Food Scrap Coalition. We now are looking bigger into food recovery, because recovery is very important when you look at food diversion. Obviously, we look at source reduction, but we look at recovery next for humans and for animals. And then we look to composting. So that's something that we've kind of broadened our horizon. And then the other thing I've learned, Public Act 100-0951 is House Bill 4790. It's very important to follow through on legislation. I've seen numerous bills get passed and signed into law and not really implemented. So we're determined to get this bill implemented and to show the usefulness of compost in projects, and to basically make it become a routine, a part of bid specs as we move forward here with our projects in Illinois, stormwater related, our other uses as well. So I think I'm going to wrap up. That's my contact information, and I'm going to turn it over to Ed.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Great presentations there. A lot of the work that has been done in Washington, Illinois is stuff that is just coming around in Tennessee. So we're great to have all this previous work that has been done, to be able to pull from a lot of this testing in scientific work that has been done to kind of pave the way. We started as the compost company 7 years ago, recycling food scraps in the Nashville area, and it was first a pretty slow uptake, and there has been a lot of recent emphasis on food waste recycling through the National Resources Defense Council Food Waste Initiative, and we actually have a pilot project in Nashville, the Nashville Food Waste Initiative, that has really raised the awareness on food scrap recycling and composting in the area. Previously, we had sold out of our compost material by usually late spring or early summer, and so we are looking for new outlets for compost as well, as our site has grown with the increased food waste recycling initiatives. So we have a surplus now through the fall season, which we have never had before. So we are definitely looking for new outlets and new markets for our compost material, rather than just the typical homeowners and small organic farms that we have normally sold to. The biggest growth that we have seen in compost use recently is in the bioretention media. Both Metro Nashville and also Clarksville require bioretention soils in stormwater quality ponds for new commercial construction. Metro Nashville has been requiring that for several years now. Clarksville just started a couple of years ago, and we are fairly centrally located between both Clarksville and Nashville, so it represents a great opportunity for us to move more of our compost material. So as some of the presenters before me have talked about, the bioretention ponds are a great way to treat stormwater runoff, and to not only for quantity but quality of the water running off. We used to just put it in a pipe and shoot it to the ditch as fast as we can, as most of us well know, and that hasn't worked so well, especially with the larger storms that we're seeing and more pavement. We're getting a lot more flooding. Tennessee had a very large flood in 2010 that hurt a lot of the Middle Tennessee area, and that further raised the awareness of stormwater issues and both slowing that runoff but also treating it. Tennessee has some of the most biodiverse streams and rivers in the world, right here in our backyards. So there's been a lot more emphasis as well on protecting those waters. And most of those waters have been designated as unclean. And so there's been a huge effort to move those out of that category and to clean those up. So many advantages of total suspended solids removal, and as David said, removing a lot of the hydrocarbons, metals, and so forth from the runoff waters. So we're really glad to see the bioretention coming along. And there's a couple of different pages here that I've got up now. And if you could go to the next slide, please. They are showing two different pages from the local regulations showing the benefits of that. Next slide, please. So this slide shows some of the requirements. In seeing David's slides, our bioretention mix varies pretty significantly from Washington's requirements. Our mix is required to be about 70 to 85% sand, 10 to 20% silt and clay with no more than 10% clay, and 5 to 10% organic matter. So for our blend, to get the analysis, we typically mix about 60% sand and 20% compost and topsoil. The ponds, I guess we're still seeing how these ponds are going to function in a lot of cases. They haven't been in long enough to test the long-term viability, but we are starting to see failures in some of these ponds where they have not been put together right. Yeah, go ahead to the next slide, please. So this is some of the ways that you can apply the bioretention, either in a rain garden situation, which can be used on small individual lots, or the bioretention basins. And this is a small bioretention basin at a strip shopping mall, but very nice looking bioretention pond, rather than seeing the old dry ponds that would fill up with water and then discharge without treating the water. And typically what you would end up having would be a weed-filled, chain-link fence-surrounded pond that was an eyesore, often had vector issues with mosquitoes, and just wasn't pleasant to look at. So the bioretention ponds are much nicer and treat the stormwater runoff much better than the old typical retention basins. Next slide, please. So this is maybe a little bit hard to see, but the requirements or the landscape architect and civil engineering plans on how the ponds are designed, and much of this depends on how large the runoff area is and what type of underlying soils are there. Most of the soils in Middle Tennessee are very heavy clay soils, pretty low infiltration rates. So we're seeing the ponds with the underdrain because we don't get the infiltration we need. So we're getting deeper ponds with underdrains. The water is pre-treated by the bioretention basins and then is allowed to flow to possibly another retention basin or off-site, depending on the flow calcs. Next slide, please. So some of the things, I'm just going to go through some of the materials here and kind of what has led to some of the issues in Metro Nashville and Clarksville, more so Metro Nashville at this point because they have been doing it longer, but is the materials that have been going into the mix. There's some oversight on what is going in the ponds, and there are, of course, specifications. Metro had a preferred vendors list, and you would send in your sample of material for analysis, get the analysis back, and send that to Metro Public Works, and also send a 5-gallon bucket of your blend to them so they could have on hand. And that is good in theory, but then what has been happening is that once that mix gets approved and you're on the approved vendors list, the vendors were trying to cut corners and save money on the mix, and so there was a lot of stuff getting installed. So what our mix consists of is 60% coarse sand, as you see here, and this is a row that we were mixing up just yesterday and today. Next slide, please. Our topsoil, and this is topsoil that has we've had on our site that we have amended previously with compost, and we will rescreen, for the bioretention media. So most, as I mentioned, is most of our soil is heavy clay, and you can see some of the clay toward the center of that pile that is much lighter in color than the more heavily amended soil. So we'll mix that soil up. Next slide, please. And add our compost. And so this is our finished compost product. As David mentioned, it's screened to 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. So we want something that's going to grow plants well, is well composted, well broken down, but also will infiltrate water and hold on to those particles. This is the piece that is often not getting put into the mix right. So we are mixing the sand, the soil, and the compost. Next slide, please. And a lot of what has been going into ponds is mulch. Some mulch more finely ground than others, and some stuff that's almost a primary grind that is getting mixed with sand and maybe a little bit of topsoil. So this has led to the ponds not growing plants well, and then once that material does start breaking down, the ponds are clogging. So the landscape architects are upset with the blend because the plants aren't growing well. The civil engineers are upset with the ponds because they're not infiltrating well. So there's a discussion going on now as to what is that ideal mix for these bioretention soils. The engineers want more sand, and the architects want more compost, so that we can get, the engineers say the sand is going to flow better. The architects say, that it's not going to grow any plants. So from our perspective and what we've been hearing on these pond installations from some contractors, haulers, regulators, and so forth, is that it's more of an issue with the mix that's getting put in and not necessarily the design. So getting that mix done properly is really important to having a good quality soil going into the pond, and also the longevity of that pond. We have seen a large increase in the amount of bioretention soils that we have been sending out. The city of Clarksville has, I believe, 4 or 5 inspectors that are inspecting the ponds inspecting the material before it gets put in the ponds. Previously, there were a couple of ponds that got installed that had to be dug back out because it failed after the install. So contractors were trying to blend themselves and mix on site with materials that they had. A couple of those ponds have failed the inspection and had to be dug back out. So that has led to an increase in the amount of soil blend we have been sending, as the contractors are really looking for high quality soil that is going to meet the specs. Even if it costs them a couple bucks more a yard on the front end, it's much cheaper than saving or having to dig that product back out. So if you'll maybe back up one more slide, please. We're blending the material here. So we've got a sand. We lay out our sand, add our compost and topsoil to that. You can see the variations in colors there, but it's really important to get the right materials and the right ratios to get into this. We went through about 5 different analysis trials on our material before we got the blend right, and we make sure we're testing not every mix that we send out, but we're testing regularly, as we know our compost is going to vary from time to time, our sand is going to vary, and the topsoils are going to vary depending on where we are sourcing it from. Next slide, please. So this is the finished mix product. It's what was left of our last job that we did. And so far it's been performing very well. We have had 0 failures on our inspections, and the ponds that have been put in with our material is doing very well so far. We've seen, as I said, a large increase in the amount of material we've been moving. So this is one of the larger compost uses that we see on the short-term horizon. We have been talking with the Department of Transportation. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So this is, before I get too far ahead, one of the installations that we have recently completed. And this one was installed with a slinger truck. Most of the time the contractors are installing with an excavator or pushing it in up to the pond with a wheel loader and then trying to install with an excavator. This method seems to work much better. You have much less chance of compaction and disturbance of the ponds and the banks before installation. And normally we'll see more sod in place before this. The inflow to the ponds must be sodded before the material goes in to make sure that it doesn't get silted in during installation in the case of a big rain. We have not seen the uptake that Illinois and Washington has, and many other jurisdictions. I know Texas is a big one with the Department of Transportation. I think there's been 1 or 2 tests here in Tennessee, but that is one that we are trying to work on as well for erosion sedimentation control along new road installations, as well as amending existing roadsides. So we are hoping to see that uptake, but there are there's a lot of bioretention going in. There are 750 active grading permits in the Nashville area right now, so it's a huge market right now. Construction in Nashville, as well as Clarksville, 2 of the largest and fastest growing jurisdictions in the state. So a huge market opportunity for compost sales, and one that we're really looking forward to, and have been working hard to make sure that we are getting those blends right, and that it's keeping the ponds functioning properly, so that we will continue to see the jurisdictions using compost and bioretention ponds as a stormwater best practice management. Next slide, please. Again, so this is the final slide, maybe a little bit better on the installation and landscape designs of these ponds, and just really making sure that these things are laid out well, the proper plants are selected, getting installed properly, and that the soils are able to support that plant life. It's just not the soils that are helping do that, but the soils will pick up those contaminants that are in the flows, and then the plants are able to take those up, help hold on to that, and break it down before the water gets out into the creeks and rivers and streams. So that's all I have for today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Ed, Walter, and David. This has been it's excellent presentations, tremendous amount of very valuable and useful information that can be utilized quickly. Just a reminder that you can use the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner to ask your questions. We have gotten a few, and I'm going to take one that was posted just more recently for a clarification question, which is, can the speakers clarify whether the compost sand soil blends are volume or weight based, just to ensure that we're all talking the same language? So maybe each of you, if you don't mind addressing that, or for sure David and Ed.
This is David. I'll start. So here in Washington, since Ed was just talking about bioretention mixes, our bioretention mix, as he noted, is pretty high in compost. We're using about 30 to 35% compost by volume mixed with 65 to 70% for sand. We always mix by volume because you can't really do it by weight. Your compost weight per volume varies hugely with its moisture content. So for mixing, we always do by volume. It's also important to note that the final organic content of the mix is then computed by the loss on combustion test method that's in the STA and ASTM test methods. And that, so for instance, to get a soil organic matter in your final mix of 10%, which is our standard for bioretention mixes, we need to use about 30% compost by volume. And if you don't understand that, it's something for you to look into and educate yourself on, because that will trip you up otherwise. The organic matter percent by the lab test is different than these volume or weight measures. But we always mix things by volume.
Right. Exact same for us. We do everything by volume. It will vary greatly, as David said, based on the moisture of the compost, but also the moisture content of the sand. Sometimes we'll get a load that came fresh off the river, and we'll have water running out of that sand as it's dumped on the ground, which always drives me nuts because you pay for the sand by weight. So I paid for 50% water and you got 50% sand and 50% water. We do it by volume, and the organic matter is 5 to 10%, so not quite as high, but that's why we have been using in a maximum of 10% clay. With the heavy clay soils here, that is one of the issues that we're running into. So we are using soil that has been already amended somewhat with compost to meet the organic matter requirements, and also not to have too much clay content. So really we're using probably more like 25% compost and 15% topsoil, since we've already amended it some previously. And our mix is fairly heavy. Some of the other mixes that we have heard about, the slinger truck that we used to install this last job, had said he normally hauls 35 yards on his truck from one of the other suppliers in Metro, and I calculated that up, and based on the weight of our mix, he would be hauling 120,000 pounds on his truck. So we knew something wasn't quite right there when we heard how much material he was able to haul from some of the other suppliers.
Excellent. One of the first, one of the first questions we got, and it was specific to the state of Florida, but I think I'll broaden it just a little bit, so this is applicable to any state, which is how can you tell whether your state DOT has approved some of these compost BMPs, like the compost burn? And what about how to learn what stormwater management departments have approved? How does one best go about finding that out?
Well, I'll go first. I get asked that a lot. And the thing is, you got to start calling people. But with your DOTs, most DOTs have their highway construction manual or something like it published online. So a good thing to do is to go to your state DOT website and just search under the word compost and see where it comes up, or open their PDF of their highway construction manual and search the word compost and see what comes up. And then to find the person you want to go to your state DOTs, typically they will, if you look at their organizational chart, they'll have a landscape design or some kind of roadside design group, and you just want to find your way through email or phone to somebody who's working in that area, and usually they've at least heard of compost. and you may find out, as you would say if you called Washington or California, oh yeah, we use that all the time. Here's our spec. Here's the link to it. Or you may, get somewhat of a blank stare. Both of those will be informative. The same on the stormwater side. You should be able to do the same thing with your state stormwater code. Typically, your state environmental agency will be administering stormwater code, and you can either search their manual for the word compost, or again, search their staff for people that deal with construction site BMPs for erosion control. See if they have a state-required erosion control training for builders and contact that program and see if they have included the compost BMPs. These erosion control BMPs, blankets, berms, and socks, are approved by the U.S. EPA under their oversight of all state stormwater programs. But whether your state has incorporated them in their manual or not is something you have to do some legwork to find out.
Anybody else on that? Okay. There are a few questions specifically for Walter, but there is a really quick one for Ed, so I'm going to ask that first before we kind of switch gears a little. And Ed, the question is, what equipment are you using to mix that blend of yours?
We are using a wheel loader. We're bucket mixing it. We used for a while a compost turner to mix it, but the material with as much sand as we have in it was pretty tough on the machine. So we're able to mix about 100 yards, maybe 150 yards an hour with a large wheel loader.
Excellent, thank you.
And this is David. I want to say that all of our facilities that do compost soil mixing out here do it that same way. They put a bucket of compost down with 2 buckets of sand, spread them out, and then use the bucket loader to just lift and mix them, and it's way faster than any other method.
Excellent, thank you. So, Walter, there's a few questions specifically regarding your slides. The first is how the Illinois Food Scrap Coalition anticipates measuring and tracking food waste in your system. I think maybe that's both for food waste recycling and also rescue recovery. So anything just related to some sort of reporting and tracking and measurement.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to do that, but what we can rely on is our compost sites. One of the things we did, we worked with the IEPA to modify the form. Every year they have to submit an annual report and indicate how much material they've taken, and it's broken down into, I believe, leaves, brush, and grass, and we had them add in food scraps and other organics. So we are starting to get a database from the compost sites themselves on how much of the different types of materials they are collecting. So we can go to that as a source to look at what's going on. We also are tracking through our We Compost program. There's hundreds of restaurants and businesses that are doing food scrap diversion that aren't We Compost members, but it is kind of a proxy for us to see, and to have that number grow so we know how many distinct businesses are actually separating their organics. And then we did have a very detailed waste composition study. We've had 2 done in the last 10 years. I believe 2014 was the last time. Sorting at the landfills into 80 different categories, statistical significance. So we have a good database of what we're putting in the landfill, and if we continue to do those studies, hopefully we'll see that number go down. And then just on my local level, I have 43 municipalities that are members of my agency. We get detailed data from each of the haulers for our franchise contracts, for our residential programs, but we're not really able to to measure effectively how much food scrap is getting commingled with the yard waste. I mean, it's definitely a challenge.
Excellent. Thank you. One question, and I know we often hear this as well, just around the country, but for Walter, as for the Illinois House Bill 4790 two-model project requirement, why do this and repeat all the legwork other states have already done? For example, Washington. Why not just review the pilot and actual projects already completed in these other states?
Well, I think we will look to that and you've helped us, Nora, give us the contact people in those other states. That's something we will be bringing, that level of information out there. But, typically when you're dealing with other states and their use of stuff, we all think that we're different. So we kind of have to reinforce and reprove to those agencies. And we also think it got us that in to the Illinois Department of Transportation. I don't know about other states, but our DOT is a very slow-moving entity, and they're very notoriously have a reputation of hard to change their minds on things. So we thought it was important to use a good product. That's why we spec SDA, find a couple good projects, get them in touch with these other DOTs. We've sent them numerous other state specs. We've loaded them up. Now let's do the studies and show this stuff works, and that it's price competitive and it actually works better. So we're at the show me. We're like Missouri. You gotta show me.
Right, and that's not atypical. I think we've seen that as well. A follow-up, is there a list of Illinois contractors that currently use compost for erosion control that might be similar to the map of composting facilities?
Boy, that would be a great list to have. I think that's a really good idea. We'll put that on the to-do list for our market development committee to try to. We know some of the big players that work for our tollway and our state Department of Transportation through our composters, but that's definitely a database and a discussion that we need to have because whether they're told to or not from above, they may want to use compost, amended soil, or compost itself for certain projects just because they know it's going to work better. And if the site is located close to the project, it's probably going to win on the price too. So that's we don't have that, but that's a good suggestion.
Wonderful, David. Here's one for you. Sorry, it's long, so bear with me as I scroll up and down. One of the initial slides you showed had pollutant reduction rates. It was a quick slide, but I believe it showed a minus 2% reduction of phosphorus. At an LID conference I attended, a couple of papers showed that there were long-term breakdown of the long-term breakdown of the organics, there is a release of phosphorus and a source as opposed to a sink. Have you monitored systems for this? So really it's a nutrient release and that slide that you showed.
Yeah, nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus generally being the trickier one. So a lot, those of you who are out in the stormwater world, a lot of discussion about it, and unfortunately a lot of incomplete information would be a polite way to put it. There are a number of sites that have been monitored show some phosphorus release, not large amount, but as you saw here, minus 0.2 in the first year of the project. So basically the first winter season, and that was the data from WashDOT that I was showing you. That particular project was the first year monitoring on that site. Succeeding years on that site, they had started having excellent phosphorus removal. You saw the 80-90% reduction in sediments, metals, nitrogen. They started having 70 to 80% removal level of phosphorus from road runoff, and that's pretty typical of projects. There are lab studies where they've basically done accelerated monitoring of samples that were not vegetated with water running through them, and where they could see very small amounts of phosphorus continuing to come off them over time, projected over time. These were lab tests, so they didn't actually run them for 5 years, but they projected that there would continue to be these relatively tiny amounts of phosphorus coming off. But they weren't vegetated sites, they weren't natural systems. What we find in natural systems is it's the plant soil matrix that does the most for you in pollutant reduction, both removing sediments but also metals, everything else. So you want to get full plant establishment on your site and getting a deep plant soil matrix. What we find then is that these soils always become net removers of phosphorus and nitrogen, metals, and other contaminants.
Great, thank you. I think we might only have time for one more question, or I'm actually going to try to slip into, if we can get a quick answer to this one, is there a blanket sock, in quotes, that is specifically approved? So I think it's, or is it, I maybe in the David, in the National EPA Stormwater Best Management Practices, when I'm pretty sure that a sock was one of the BMPs in there, if I recall.
So if you go to our building soil website and look over on the right at the erosion control fact sheet, it links to the standard national specifications off of the US EPA website, menu of construction BMP's website. So the EPA has approved standard specifications for compost blankets, compost socks, and compost berms, and you can find them there. You actually can't find them on the EPA website right now because they've reorganized, but that was what's on our site was downloaded from EPA. They were approved probably 15 years ago. But then in your state, or perhaps in your locality, you have to look at what your state or locality has approved. The fact that the EPA has approved these standard specifications, and they're very good specifications, by the way, doesn't mean that your local jurisdiction necessarily has. So you need to look to your state stormwater agency.
Thank you. And I know we're at time, but this is an important question. So for those of you who can hang on, and speakers as well, and this will be the last question. The question is on the availability of a toolkit for calculating needed volume of compost based on application method for treatment of different types of runoffs. Are there studied formulas for this? And this may be a long answer, but just as succinct as any of you can be. Thank you.
So I'll go first. On both our Building Soil and Soils for Salmon website, you'll find our Building Soil Manual, which is our guidance for builders on how to implement the state BMPs. It shows the formula that we use for computing amount of amendment to reach a desired amount of soil organic matter. And on the Soils for Salmon website, you'll also find a link to an Excel spreadsheet that you can download that will do those calculations for you.
Excellent. Anybody else? Ed, do you have?
No, unfortunately, I don't have anything to add.
Wonderful. And as we mentioned, and you'll have seen David and Walter's and contact information, there's the slides that David showed are huge resources, and I, to this day, use a lot of the slides David showed in presentations on this topic. Well, thank you to David McDonald, Walter Willis, and Ed Wansing, for your presentations today. It's excellent. Thank you to everybody who participated. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, please consider becoming a member of the Composting Collaborative. Any company, organization, or government entity is eligible to become a member, and membership is free. You can access the application at compostingcollaborative.org. And you'll also be able to stay in the loop about future webinars, in-person events. Also, our next webinar by the Composting Collaborative is next month, Wednesday, October 17th. It will be brought to you by the U.S. Composting Council, and they'll be presenting Nurturing Entrepreneurship to Grow Composting Infrastructure. Thank you all so much again for joining, and a reminder that the slides and the recording from today's webinar should be in your inbox no later than tomorrow morning, if not still this afternoon. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.